I can hear you. I can still hear you, though. Just talk. Just project.
Project.
No, Liz can't hear you. I can hear you, though. Yep. Nope, she can't.
I can hear you through the...
Oh.
I'm reading your lips, but I can hear you.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, we should do a... I feel like once we're up there... And you have a bold looking...
Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bold TV. I'm Carrie Sheffield here with my guest host, Liz Plank.
Hi, Carrie.
Hello, Liz. So Liz is a senior correspondent from Vox Media, and so excited to have you, Liz.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you all for watching on Facebook and Periscope. Don't forget to like our page, Bold TV.
Yeah.
Also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat.
We really want to hear from you because we love you. So make sure to add your questions and comments during the show. And if you love Bold TV, share the conversation with your friends. I'm not being rude. I'm sharing the live
She's
right now.
doing it right now. That's
I'm
what
doing
y'all
it.
should
I'm
be
modeling
doing right now.
behavior.
This is modeling behavior.
Yeah.
Model.
Yes.
Model.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rainy day here in New York. It's like, to my mind, it's like God's crying or something. It's just like,
Yep.
This has been a terrible week. And, you know, our thoughts are definitely with the victims of the violence from last weekend's events in Charlottesville. We especially are sad for Heather Heyer, 32-year-old woman killed by a car that plowed into the crowd gathered to protest against white supremacists. Liz, what was your reaction to all this?
I, like many Americans and many people, I think, across the world, were just sickened by the weekend's events and by the reaction of the president. I think that as a progressive, I think there were a lot of scenarios that progressives started conjuring when Donald Trump won the presidency, of scenarios of things that could happen. But I really think no one could have imagined seeing the president sympathize with people who are neo-Nazis and who have murdered a woman, and to have that reaction, especially after what we need is all to be sort of coming together against this, not to be dividing and to be giving a voice to these violent extremists. And we were talking about this before we came on air. There's no silver lining, but at least what we hope will happen is a real, deep conversation and necessary conversation about Confederate statues.
Right, and we're going to get more into that through a later segment as well, specifically on the statues question.
Right.
But I mean, I my heart's with you too, Liz. As our viewers know, I have tried to understand what the Trump voters have been saying by electing this president, and I've tried to push on the policies that I agree with him. And I do believe what Abraham Lincoln said, which is that you stand with someone when they're right and you part with them when they're wrong. Mm-hmm. And in this instance, President Trump is wrong. There's no way to sugarcoat it. I think he's lost his moral authority as it relates to this. There's just no way to say that there are very fine people who are sympathizing and marching around with torches and neo-Nazis. There's just no way to sugarcoat that. I think there are some good people who, think that having monuments are okay. And there are some good people, but they weren't there that night in Charlottesville. Those
Right.
are not good people. And to have that lack of moral clarity, I was severely disappointed. Mm-hmm. And, I think that there's no and or but to say at the end of
Mm-hmm.
the sentence, Nazism and white supremacy is wrong.
Right.
There's no qualifier to put there. There's no way that you can say, well, the other side was doing it too. Mm-hmm. And certainly I have called out on this show the violence from the left, but there's no way to say that there are very fine people who are doing this. I
Right.
mean, it's just contrary to everything in our country about, this is a place where no matter who you are, we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Right. And I think one of the scariest things coming from that press conference is that it felt like he was rewriting history, right? Like he was rewriting the history of what happened and what we all saw and what the people who were there saw happen in Charlottesville, right? That everyone came up with clubs, that everyone came out and was violent. It's just not true. And even, the Vice reporter who did this amazing mini doc, I mean, it looks like a mini doc. They just did it over the weekend. You see the Friday night rally. It was not neo-Nazis. It was Jews will not replace us. Other chants I can't even really repeat. And for Donald Trump to say that was that was fine, is incredibly scary. And so his fear that Confederate statues or taking them down will somehow erase history. What erases history is what he's doing and saying about what happened this weekend in Charlottesville. I want to hear your thoughts about the Republican reaction, how conservatives have reacted to Charlottesville.
Yeah, so we have a headline where a number of lawmakers have condemned this. Republicans, it's been interesting because some have been explicitly condemning Trump and others are just condemning Nazism and white supremacy in the abstract.
Right.
And I think that is moral cowardice to not call out Trump specifically for not denouncing them.
Right.
I think there's
I
a
agree.
distinction. And the first night of the chaos, I understand maybe Trump didn't want to jump to conclusions. We didn't know who was killed. We didn't know who was driving the car. I get that. And then he did come out explicitly on Monday and condemn these groups explicitly, which was good. And then by Tuesday, it was like, nope, I had this statement in my teleprompter, and now I feel like I was like a coward for reading it, and so now I'm going to completely undo everything that I said. And I watched an interview with Vice again.
Right.
Vice is doing doing some great reporting, but they did an interview with Senator Tim Scott, the first black senator elected in the South post-Reconstruction, and he said, I liked the comments that he made on Monday. They were strong, but then by Tuesday, it was just, he had lost his moral authority. And Tim Scott has been through a lot, as a black Republican, he gets it from everyone.
Right.
And to say that, the president has lost your moral authority, I don't know what the path is forward for Donald Trump, because he doesn't seem to realize that this is a problem.
Right. Do you think, but I feel like we've said this a lot, right? We've said this a few times, even as him as a candidate. Do you think that this is a real juncture for the Republican Party, that there's going to be action behind the tweets?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this, and actually there is an editorial that I read from the Wall Street Journal from Jason Riley, who's my favorite writer on issues of race. He is a black conservative, and in the Wall Street Journal, we can put the headline up. He says that Trump follows Obama's example of moral equivalence.
Right.
And in the article, he says, we've seen this show before, because what happened in Dallas, where a black violent extremist murdered 5 innocent cops, and what President Obama said was, "This is terrible, it's wrong, but yet sometimes cops kill black people." And I would say, no, it is wrong to kill cops. Period.
Right.
There are no qualifiers. There should be no qualifiers. And to me, and it should have been the same for Donald Trump. And so I see this level of failure on, it's like a dark mirror image. It's like the yin to the yang. And the only way to stop it is for Donald Trump to say, no, love is greater than hate. And he's perpetuating it, and he's not even realizing. I don't understand why he doesn't realize this is so hateful. I don't. I mean, he's clearly past the point of emotional awareness or numbness. I don't know.
I mean, this is my own theory, and it's a theory that I think that I was watching CNN, the ghostwriter for his book, The Art of the Deal. His name is escaping me right now, but he said Donald Trump has one sort of vector of sort of seeing the world, and it's through himself. And these people, some of them were wearing "Make America Great Again" hats. These people were very happy after his comments. You look online, a lot of reporters have been doing amazing work who are embedded in these sort of alt-right groups and who are seeing the reaction. These people now feel, vindicated, like they feel happy and they feel like Donald Trump was speaking to them. And so I think that Donald Trump knows that this is part of his base. And instead of disavowing them, he's embracing them.
Well, Rhonda Lee Deschamps, hi Rhonda Lee, good morning. She says that he's afraid of losing those white supremacists and neo-Nazis from his base of supporters. And Pam Little says, hello from Charlotte, such a tragic week. It's just, and Jonathan Ayala, he's here watching from Lubbock, Texas. Jonathan, would love to hear your thoughts in a very strong Texas Trump state. What's the reaction there? I'm curious. Jonathan, let us know. But it's just, what I don't understand is, like, Trump won because Obama voters who had voted for Obama twice flipped and voted for Trump. I don't think those people would be white supremacists. I just don't. So even mathematically, I don't understand his math, because the people who flipped and gave the victory to him are probably not neo-Nazis. They're just mathematically not going to be someone who voted for a black guy twice. So I don't understand that politically. I also obviously don't morally understand it either.
Right. Moving on. I mean, there'll be lots of. I mean, what's good is again the conversation that's coming out of it. These issues that are have been sort of under the surface are now below or out there
they're here in daylight,
and we can talk about them. So we're really excited to be joined by our first guest today, Representative Dan Donovan, a Republican congressman from New York's 11th district. Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman.
Good to be with
really
you, Liz. Carrie, nice to see you again.
Thank you for weathering the storm to get all the way here. Is it still raining out there?
It's still raining out.
Okay.
So if your listeners and your viewers are inside doing this, stay where you are.
Stay there. Well, we really appreciate you coming out and speaking with us. What are your reactions to what happened in Charlottesville this weekend?
The tragedy, I don't think we can condone any hatred, any violence. Subsequent to that, we had the tragedy in Barcelona yesterday. We live in a dangerous times, but when you have moronic people who are going to drive a car into a group of people who have an opinion that's different than theirs, that's not what our country is about. That's not what the fabric of this nation is. We respect people of different opinions. We allow people to assemble and free speech with reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner. We don't condone hate speech. And certainly we don't condone people who think we should eliminate people because of their race or their religion. So we had a tragedy here in our homeland. We had a tragedy in Spain. We live in a very dangerous time, and I think that particularly in Charlottesville, I mean, tolerance or understanding a difference of opinions, whether or not a statute or whether or not a street should be named after a Confederate general, is an issue that can be debated. And people have different opinions, and people have a reason why they believe those street namings should remain, and there are those who believe that they should be removed for certain reasons. And that's one of the great things about our country, is to be able to have debate. You don't have a right to run people over with a vehicle.
Right. Well, and Congressman, you're from a district, Staten Island, parts of Brooklyn. Your district in general went for Trump.
They did.
So what's your takeaway listening to the president? Do you disagree with his take to say there were some good people there that night with the torches?
You know, I don't think there's anything good about people saying we should eliminate people of a race or a religious sect. But I think the people who voted throughout our country for President Trump were people who were frustrated. I think he struck a nerve with people who are hardworking Americans who felt that the previous leadership for the 8 years prior wasn't what America once was, or their vision of America, whether we be a world leader or what we were doing domestically in helping American families and American workers. And you know, I heard part of the earlier segment when you were talking about who are these Trump voters. Were they Barack Obama voters who couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton? Was it people who couldn't vote for her, couldn't vote for Donald Trump, and her voters went to Jill Stein and Gary Johnson, and if they had voted for her, if those two people weren't in the race, would she be the president now? But I think there's a lot of Americans who are very proud of our country, who are disappointed in the previous administration, and it might have been the right time for my friend Donald Trump. I've known the president for 20 years. He's a fellow New Yorker. He had toyed with the idea of doing this many other times.
Well, and when people say who know him, they say he himself is not racist.
No, he's not a racist.
And yet he is using this tool. So thereby association, is he not using that toolkit of a racist?
Yeah, the president's certainly not a racist, and the president certainly doesn't condone any violent acts. His message sometimes may come out differently than he even intends it to. Sometimes I heard, as you were saying earlier, his message seemed to be different on Tuesday than it was of Monday of this week. But the president certainly doesn't support the neo-Nazis who are wearing, people who wear hoods, people who burn crosses, people who think that if you're Jewish, you should be eliminated from this planet, and if you're African American, you're an inferior human being. I don't outside of maybe their own individual group, I don't think there's anyone in this nation that believes those things.
Then why are the people who are saying those things, a lot of them are supporting Donald Trump?
I mean, listen, people support a candidate for different reasons. And people vote for somebody for different reasons. Some people might have thought the economy needed a boost and voted for Donald Trump. Some people might have thought our national security was lacking, and that's why they voted for Donald Trump. I was a prosecutor for 20 years. I used to say jurors, if they acquit a defendant, one could believe that the lighting was poor. One could not have believed the main witness. Another one thought, prosecutors should have presented DNA, but they all voted no. So for what reasons people voted for Donald Trump, I suspect many of those were individual reasons. People without a job probably wanted him to stimulate the economy so that he created jobs. People who were in my business, and I'm on Homeland Security Committee, I mean, we're responsible for the protection of this nation. Maybe think we needed a stronger leader, and maybe thought he would be a better leader in protecting our nation from our enemies, those who want to harm our people.
Sure, and we know, speaking of the Homeland Security Committee, we know that they're going to be holding a hearing on domestic terrorism. What are you going to be looking at in that hearing?
Well, a lot of the domestic terrorism we're finding now is, years ago, people used to have to go to Syria, be trained to be a terrorist, and then be dispatched to whatever part of the globe they were supposed to conduct their evil deeds. Now we have people on a laptop in their basement being radicalized in Omaha, Nebraska, Ames, Iowa, and New York City. They read Inspire magazine. They're told how to make an explosive device. They're told to use any common tool that could cause harm, such as a knife, or as we saw this week, a vehicle. And use that tool and harm as many people as you can. And they prey upon people, some who have low self-esteem, some who are alone. There's signs that we found through, I'm a lawyer by trade, but psychologists and psychiatrists told us that they look for vulnerable people. You could sometimes see the traits, and it's a romance on the computer.
Right.
And at some point you promise that you're going to sacrifice yourself, but for a better cause, a bigger cause than yourself. And there are people who swallow that garbage.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly the white supremacists seem to fit that description of everything you just said in terms of getting radicalized. Do you think that, we have a question here from the audience. Congressman, you have a vote. Will you vote to remove the Confederate statues from the Capitol?
I'm not too sure we're going to actually have a vote on that. The House Administrator decides that. So I don't think we get to vote on that. But again,
Paul
I think
Ryan has said that he wants to leave it up to the states rather than making it a federal issue. He said that publicly.
we had an issue last year or the year before about removing the Confederate flag from the Capitol. The problem was there wasn't one. But it was embedded in a state flag, and I forget which state it was. It might have been Mississippi, but I don't want to offend anybody by saying the wrong state. So they would have to chisel out the state flag, and I think that decision was made, as you just said, to allow the state to decide what emblems or symbols they want on their state flag, and not for the federal government to tell people what they should do. We give power to the states, the federal government, when our forefathers created this great Constitution of ours that has only been amended a little more than 24 times in 240 years. They had the foresight to say, centralized government in Washington, or at that time, whether it be in New York or Philadelphia, shouldn't dictate to the states. We give autonomy to states. That's why states have different ages in which you could drive. They have different ages in which you could drink alcohol or buy cigarettes, because we give autonomy to states.
Shouldn't there be moral clarity coming from the top about these sort of issues?
Well, again, I mean, the folks in the South might feel different about Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee than the people in the North did. Our country was divided at that time so badly. We had a war among ourselves. And so, again, history, these people were figures in history, whether people agreed with their military records. I don't think anybody condoned their support for slavery. But are they being honored because they were some sort of military leader, or are they being honored?
Military to basically be treasonous, I think. That's if we're going to get more into this later, maybe we should move to another topic, which is healthcare. I do want to talk about that because I know that you were one of the few Republicans who voted against the Obamacare replacement bill that did pass the House.
Yes.
Why did you vote against it?
It was going to be harmful to the people of New York, the people I represent. It was going to cause New Yorkers to pay more taxes for health care without receiving any further benefit. It was going to cause seniors to pay up to 5 times as much for health care as a young, healthy person at a time when many of our seniors live on limited incomes and probably need health care more than they did in their earlier years. So it just wasn't a good replacement plan for the people I represent. Now, our health care system is broken. It needs repair. We have families paying $20,000, $25,000 in premiums, pay $6,000 deductibles and astronomical co-pays, and decide that it's unaffordable to go to a doctor. We had many young people decide that when the Affordable Care Act was passed to take the penalty on their taxes because we were requiring people to have health care. And if you didn't, you paid a penalty. Well, the penalty was cheaper than buying health care. And so many people opted, so it didn't work. Now we're seeing the increase in premiums being requested by insurance companies in the exchanges. Many insurance companies dropped out of the exchanges. It's collapsing upon itself. So we have to help the people of this country with a health care policy that works for them. So I'm a believer that we could do some things on a bipartisan basis that will help America. The Affordable Care Act was passed with only Democratic votes. Not one Republican voted for it. The replacement plan, although I voted no, the replacement plan was passed without one Democratic vote. It was all Republican. If we keep doing health care policies for this country on a partisan basis, every time the power of our government shifts, we'll have a new health care policy for this nation. It's not fair to patients, it's not fair to families, it's not fair to physicians. I think health care is probably a nonpartisan, it's not even bipartisan, it's a nonpartisan issue. Right. We have to figure out how to give people adequate health care, access to that, and make it affordable. I'm a lawyer by trade, not an economist, but I still believe that we could do that.
And what are the bipartisan principles that would bring people together to do just that? Because I agree it is really tough when you're going from one administration to the other. It's like ping pong, and you do want to have some consistency. But what are the principles do you think that would bring people, Republicans and Democrats, together?
Well, I think one of the things is when President Obama left office, right before he left office, I was in Congress, he came to Capitol Hill, and he asked the Democratic caucus not to help the Republicans undo the piece of legislation that he'll go down in history known for, the Affordable Care Act. And they kept that commitment. I think their commitment ought to be to the people they represent, and there's things that they could agree on. Mm-hmm. If buying insurance across state lines causes competition, which drives premiums down, and again, I'm not an economist, but if we're told this will happen, let's just pass that and see if it happens. Mm-hmm. If allowing people, allowing seniors to pay less on their health care because all those healthy years, they've been paying and not using the system. People are saying, oh, seniors should pay more because they're absorbing, they're using the system more. Yeah, but for those 40 years prior to this, they paid into it and didn't use it. They deserve this. Mm-hmm. So I think there's things that we could agree on if we just take the partisanship out and pass those things and let Americans see that their health care is improving, their access is more accessible to health care, and that they're able to afford it. And we see those movements, then we can deal with the more difficult things.
Right. And just in closing, we only have a few minutes left. We want to ask about your latest bill, the Anti-Terrorism and Disaster Preparedness Bill. Can you tell us a little bit about why you are putting that forward?
Yeah, I mean, our country has to be prepared. I chair a committee on Homeland Security that deals with terrorism and natural disasters, prepare and response to these two tragic events that could happen to our country. And you talk about our community. I mean, 16 years ago in Lower Manhattan, we saw the greatest attack on our homeland. And 5 years ago, this October, will be the anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. So for my ability to be in a chairmanship of a committee of such importance to our community, I look for things that I think will help us. And we respond well at times to natural disasters, terrorist attacks. But this is talking about how do we prepare for one, maybe prevent them from happening, or if they happen, how do you mitigate the damage to this? How do we give access? What steps can we take before one of these events happens to protect our citizens and our homeland? So that's the purpose of it. I think there's a lot we could do in the area. We learned a lot from Katrina. We learned a lot from September 11th, 2001. We learned a lot from Superstorm Sandy. Right. We have to take those lessons and make sure we don't make the same mistakes again.
So, Congressman, you're talking about a lot of substance, and I know you also have a tax reform bill. You're looking to lower burdens for people here in New York, which I appreciate. But here's my question. How are we going to have any substance and policy and actual things passing if there's this firestorm in the media where all the oxygen is sucked out of the room?
There's such distractions now. No one knows. I suspect none of you viewers know that the House, in the first 8 months of Congress, passed 279 bills. 256 of those are stuck in the Senate with no action. But a lot of work is being done down there, and I believe the citizens of this nation are being served well. But the distractions, by the time we get to something good we've done in the news, we've talked about Russia's influence in our election to nauseam. We've spoken about whatever the president said today or yesterday or 4 days ago. And so when we get to the substance of what's actually happened, it gets lost. Your show is on for a limited amount of time, but when you have a 24-hour news cycle, I'm so old, the news used to be on at 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock for a half hour, and half of that was weather and sports.
I want to go back to those days. I would gladly.
Well, the other thing that we used to find is that if you wanted the network's editorial, their opinion, they would go on and say, this is the opinion of the network. Now for 24 hours, all you hear is people's opinions.
Yes, breaking views.
Breaking views, I like it,
my
Carrie.
likes to say.
That's a good one.
All right. Well, Congressman, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be with
Come
both
back.
of you. Thank you.
And best of luck as you keep focusing on your policy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. That was Congressman Dan Donovan from New York's 11th District. And let's pull in a few comments here. Pam Little says, why is it not obvious to Congress that healthcare is a nonpartisan issue? And Yvonne Hilton says, whatever happened to local government deciding these matters of moral clarity? And Pam Little says, Congressman Donovan, with all due respect, how can you support this president, especially now, even if he's your friend? And another commenter says, do you think conservatism needs a revival in our country, like people who actually believe in smaller government, yet without cognitive dissonance? I'm totally with you right there. But let's move on now to our panel discussion on Charlottesville, brought to you by Change.org. Change.org is the world's largest petition platform and hub for civic organizing. Its mission is to empower individuals everywhere to create the change they want to see in the world. They do this by providing tools that are free for everyday people to start campaigns, mobilize supporters, and work with decision makers to drive solutions. Let's watch a quick informational video about the site.
No one is powerless on change.org.
So every day, more than 180 million people in almost 200 countries sign change.org petitions.
And join movements to change laws and push for policies that improve people's lives.
You too can be a voice of change.
Think about the causes that matter to you, that move you.
The possibilities are endless.
Great, thank you, Change.org. And we are happy to welcome our panelists here for our Change.org discussion. First, we have Chloe Valdary, a commenter and thought leader and friend of Bold. We also have L.Joy Williams, a national political strategist, creator, and host of #SundayCivics. And she's also the president of NAACP's Brooklyn chapter. It's her first time on the show. Welcome, L.Joy, and welcome, Chloe.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So we're going to take a look at our petitions. The first one is going to from Change.org. It's calling for the ACLU to stop protecting hate speech and petitioning the website hosting service Squarespace to take down websites owned by white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups.
So this is a really important debate right now. I was just listening to the New York Times podcast, and they had a reporter sort of embedded in one of these groups where the Charlottesville basically rally was organized, and now the group is the website has sort of shut down that group. But these websites, right? The internet is such a breeding ground for the alt-right and for these white supremacist groups to organize and to then go outside in the real world and really create havoc. So what are your thoughts on this petition? Do you think that we should sort of censor certain groups on the internet?
Do you want to get
L.Joy, go first.
No. I think it's part of, I think to be against, and this is a general statement, and I'll go more in depth into my thoughts in terms of what free speech and sort of policing hate speech is. But personally, I don't think we should throttle or limit anybody's opportunity on the internet. I think for me that would go against my views on net neutrality and making sure that everybody has access and not limiting other people based upon what they're saying. To that end, I think often people get confused on what free speech or the value that we have as free speech means, right? Everybody likes to say, I have free speech according to the Constitution, but what that limits is actually the government from throttling or limiting your speech. Certainly, Squarespace, GoDaddy, or any other private company or entity, it can limit, and we see this what Facebook does that in terms of limiting what they would allow. They have community guidelines or guidelines of service that are allowed. But what the free speech provision is that the government does not have the ability to limit your speech. Second to that, I think there is a conversation as a collective society that we can say collectively, we do not tolerate hate speech. We do not tolerate speech that incites violence and that continues to incite people to have, to promote discrimination, bigotry, and racism. So collectively as a society, we have already determined that. Some modern day, it's been like modern day, right?
You're distinguishing between official government action against free speech versus cultural or private sector or a nonprofit in the case of ACLU.
And there is a difference. And so I think what ACLU hangs their hat on is that, everyone, should be able to say whatever they want and sort of march and, do things like, and do things like that. But here's where I disagree with them, right? Because you had to engage, that entity had to engage with government in order to get the permit, right? And so from their aspect, they are saying that, government should not limit this person's, or this entity's speech. However, it then goes the next step of inciting violence, of inciting bigotry, of inciting racism, and sort of creating an environment that is not conducive and safe for all people. So then that is where I think government should step in and say, we can't have this because of the nature and the content of what it promotes.
I'm going to ask Chloe this question to follow up on what you just said, because here's my question. Where do we draw the line between protecting against incitement? So, for example, I'm a pro-life woman. Sometimes there are people who bomb abortion clinics. I think that's evil. That's pure evil. That's heinous. I don't condone that at all. But should my rights as a pro-life individual be, whether by government or private sector, I guess for this particular petition, they're talking about private sector to push pressure on private sector, but in general with government as well, where do you draw the line, Chloe?
Well, I think in this particular situation, we're talking about society trying to deal with the tension between creating a free society and creating a virtuous society, right? And I think that the petition is concerned with trying to create a virtuous society. But our Constitution is as such that we value, in many cases, freedom over virtue, which means we cannot legislate virtuous citizens in many contexts. We can legislate, or we can create an environment where citizens will be free to say horrible things, free to say things that are very insulting and very offensive, but the First Amendment wasn't really written to protect popular speech. It was written to protect unpopular speech, and because that proves our dedication to free speech. And so while I, of course, am personally offended by a lot of the the racist ideas and racist speeches that are given by members of the KKK or stated by members of the KKK in Charlottesville, I understand that they have a total right to do so, and they have a total right to speak in that manner, because that is what we are talking about when we talk about free speech. We are trying to protect the most heinous forms of speech.
So does this apply to, let's say there's a group organizing ISIS, picking out vulnerable men in society and encouraging them to go bomb people?
Well,
would that apply to that group too?
So there are certain laws that we have that do, you can't actually incite to violence. Inciting to violence is illegal. You can't say to someone, go kill this person. That is actually illegal. You can't, cry fire in a crowded room, right? There are certain laws that limit our speech, but if actually in general, and you can check with lawyers to clarify this, in general, if someone, let's say an imam or a member of ISIS says, down with Americans, or Americans should be murdered, if he's not being very specific in talking about the individual that he wants to kill, saying on this day go kill this person, then I believe that's actually covered under free speech laws.
But I think in all of the examples, you asked the question in terms of where's the line. And in all of the examples that are being used, they are examples of things that incite violence. So your example of being pro-life, I believe that you're saying, in terms of people bombing things, that is violence. Right? The act of, inciting someone to kill someone or inciting discrimination, or all of those things are violence. So the line is violence. The line is your free speech versus my right and protection of my body and protection of who we are as a people. I think that is the line. And that's very clear to be able to define, that. And so we have to decide, and again, as Chloe's mentioned in terms of our virtue, and I think her statement is true, and one that I believe as well. It's the reason why on some of the, I'm more liberal in my political thinking, that I say we can't legislate, your particular faith, and believe that everyone should follow that way. And that could be on abortion, it can be on the rights of same-sex couples or anything, right? You can't legislate based upon your personal belief. But I think the line is very clear, and that's a violence. The other thing I would add to that is your right to free speech doesn't prevent you from the repercussions of that free speech, right? And so quite often what people, say is, I have a right to free speech, and to say that, you should be, you are less than me, it doesn't, I also have the free speech to cuss you the hell out.
Well, and,
right?
and also to see some of these neo-Nazis now trying to walk it back or say, I'm not that bad, once they've been identified on the internet.
Which is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen.
So let's move to the next one. And by the way, Chloe, I'm glad you brought up the word virtue. A plug for a future thing we're doing. We're partnering with 90 Second Y on Ben Franklin Virtue Circles to talk about the virtue. So you guys will both have to come back and talk about that.
Amazing.
Let's go to our next petition. It was started by actress Julianne Moore and producer Bruce Cohen, calling to rename a high school in Virginia, which is currently named after a Confederate general. This leads us to the bigger question, in terms of the significance of having these memorials in today's society and the significance of renaming or removing them, what should be the criteria to do this, Chloe?
It's a great question. So I'm from New Orleans originally. So I don't know if you guys know, Mitch Landrieu recently gave a very moving speech about how all of the Confederate statues were coming down, including the Robert E. Lee statue that graced my presence every time I drove through New Orleans. I think that in this situation, it's very wise to take it down, considering that this school was named after this person in order to protest integration, actually. And if you read the details of the petition, they say how they went to this school and the Confederate flag was a part of the spirit of the school. It was raised often. So I think in this situation, it's very clear that if you have a monument put up with the intent to honor the Confederacy, I think that that's a good rationale to take it down. And I think that this is the distinction between actually a Robert E. Lee monument and a George Washington monument, which, this debate has been coming up this week. I think the difference is that the monuments that were built to George Washington, although he was a slave owner, were not built in honor of him because he was a slave owner, right? They were built in honor of him because of all the other values, or rather the the good things that he did as opposed to the bad things. In contrast, the Robert E. Lee Monument and other monuments to the Confederacy were put up oftentimes post-Reconstruction in the Jim Crow South to deliberately, sort of have a hold of terror on recently freed former slaves, and that's
a very interesting distinction. I mean, I would make the distinction too that George Washington created America, and Robert E. Lee wanted to destroy America. So to me, that's pretty clear. But where do you draw the line, L.Joy, in terms of? So I saw some people on the internet posting about Bill Clinton and how he paid out $800,000 in sexual harassment. So as a woman, if I see a statue of Bill Clinton, does that upset me? Or Martin Luther King opposed gay marriage. As a gay person seeing a statue, where do you draw the line between saying this statue embodies something that offends me, that is just wrong for everything I represent?
Well, two things. I think, Chloe's point in terms of understanding intent is important. When we're talking about, and someone, I promote civic literacy and civic education quite often, and it's the, point of my show. And the part of it is to have civic knowledge and skills, you have to be able to understand history, understand the root and the cause of certain things, in order to be informed, and also to have all of the information to evaluate legislation, policy, and current culture. And so understanding that those symbols were put up in a time to create terror, to create fear, and to really sort of be a symbol as don't get too uppity, don't get too, you're not quite equal, because here is a symbol of the time where, as this part of America, we tried to put you back or to keep you enslaved, right? And so that's why it's partly, and knowing that history and that context is important even in our policy. And so you bring up Bill Clinton, right, as an example in terms of setting up monuments of other people that we now hail as heroes or as great political figures. It is important to know the context and history in which he enacted legislation, in which policies were discussed and laws were passed in order to apply it to present day. And so that is an important part of civic knowledge and civic participation, to understand the content. And so then knowing the history and context, then are you then okay with still having that symbol, knowing the purpose of its existence? And that's why I think that's important. The second thing is, I have a balance of believing in local authority and federal oversight, right? And so as communities, if the community is deciding that we don't want this, and I would say the larger community and not just a subsection, because I live in New York City where neighborhoods are changing, and a small section of a new community can change the very fabric and culture of an existing community. But if the majority is saying that we know the context and history, we lived in New Orleans all my life, we lived here, and we don't want this here because of what it stands for, then I believe in local authority to supersede any sort of culture or heritage people are claiming, which I think is a whole nother conversation.
Are you a lawyer? You sound like a lawyer. No, it's a very thoughtful, rational conversation from both of you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, this is a debate that's ongoing, and hopefully the beginning of a healthy debate about this issue. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
L.Joy Williams and Chloe Valdary. And thank you to Change.org for that segment. That was great. And now we're super excited to welcome John Cox. He's a Republican candidate for California in the governor election. He's here on Skype, I believe. John, are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, John. Good morning. It's early there.
No, I'm half the day's gone already. I've already gotten a workout.
Oh,
wow.
Better than us sitting here eating donuts and coffee. So we heard that there are some people who have referred to you as California's version of Bernie Sanders. I feel like I know the answer to this question, but do you like that comparison?
Well, I'm white-haired. I'm from Chicago. I don't have a Brooklyn accent. But I do agree with Bernie on one important thing, and that is that our political system has been captured by the people who have a lot of money and who spend it to buy politicians. Now, most of Bernie's other policy ideas I don't agree with, and I have to tell you I don't agree with public financing of campaigns because it still leaves the door open for people with a lot of money to spend money on independent expenditures, which can have as much or even a greater impact on policy than giving money directly to a candidate. But I do agree with Bernie on the idea that our politics is for sale. And all you have to do is look at a state like California. They call it the blue state model. And it basically involves a lot of interest groups, public sector unions for one, but big business for another, who basically engage in a money arms race to see who can spend the most money and buy the most politicians and get the most policy turned in their favor. And
well, you're sounding a little bit like Donald Trump, because that was his whole thing, to say, I'm not bought, I'm not in the pocket. Jeb Bush spent $100 million. He spent far less. He did this guerrilla warfare where he really had asymmetrical warfare from his tweets. So do you think that that's a problem now? I mean, because Hillary also outspent Trump in the general as well.
Well, first of all, I'm not Donald Trump. I have an entirely different style. I'm from Chicago. I think that means I'm a little bit more consensus-driven and nicer. I've dealt with some New York business people. A lot of them would almost rather punch in the nose than shake your hand. But I believe in trying to appeal to people's better angels, as it were. I'm also more of a policy wonk. I read 5-6 newspapers a day and really study the issues. But I think, Trump got elected in large part because he did say he was going to drain the swamp. Now, it may well have been true that he was a billionaire. I'm not. I'm a small businessman. And I've jump-started my campaign with a little bit of my resources, but I'm certainly not going to be able to fund it all with my own money. But the concept is the same, and that is pointing out that our politicians raise money. They're basically professional fundraisers. They're in the most part not policy leaders. They kind of parrot what the funders of campaigns want them to say and do, and I think the public understands that. Draining the swamp was certainly a very popular aspect of President Bush's message, or President Trump's message. But I will say this. I'm not asking the voters of California to trust me that I can't be bought or that I am so rich that I am not going to be bought. I'm also sponsoring a ballot initiative that will be on the ballot in 2018 that shrinks the districts down to such a microscopic size. I mean, only a couple thousand people, so that campaigns truly can be run by going door to door and won't require the huge budgets for television and radio and mail that the campaigns now require. That, to me, is the major structural change that I'm going to be proposing, in addition to obviously bringing my business experience to bear.
And speaking of Donald Trump, what did you think about his press conference and his comments this week, saying that there were nice people, very nice people, amongst a crowd of neo-Nazis?
I think it's a huge missed opportunity to really take the moral high ground. I can't believe for a moment that he thinks that there are nice people who are neo-Nazis. I didn't have any relatives who were lost in World War II, but I visited Auschwitz and I've seen the horrible evil that Nazism represented. And I think it's just abhorrent, the idea that you would, countenance that behavior. Now, again, having said that, I'll give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt that he didn't intend to say that there were nice people. Mr. Trump is not very good with words. I don't believe he trained very well to be a political leader. I've been involved in politics for 30 years at different levels, and so I think I maybe have a little bit more experience in speaking. And I wish he would focus on the things that people want to have done, and which I support him on, like repatriating $3 trillion from overseas and getting our infrastructure built. The roads in California are horrendous, mainly because of the corruption of Caltrans, but we need a lot of federal help here too.
But John, toward that end, I mean, Trump is really not popular in California. And I know the issue of sanctuary cities and immigration. It's pretty tense there in terms of how California views things. And some people have even tried to say we need to secede from the union, or there's just a vast transfer of wealth that's coming from California to a lot of the red states that voted for Trump. So how are you going to associate or disassociate, or you as a Republican, are you tied to Trump?
No, I don't believe I'm tied to Trump any more than I'm tied to anybody else who adopts the Republican label. I mean, I think Republican Party stands for opportunity. It stands for free enterprise. It stands for personal responsibility and free markets and principles. It doesn't stand for just one person. And I think that's important too. I could think of some Democrats that have disgraced the party of their membership, and I don't think anybody runs around saying that anybody who runs under the Democrat label, there's all kinds of Democrat politicians that have ended up in jail. I don't think anybody runs around saying that the Democratic Party is composed of one person. It's about the principles of the party. I'm a Republican. I started out in life a Democrat, by the way, but I'm a Republican because I believe in people. I believe in opportunity. I believe in free enterprise and the potential of people to make themselves successful and to make their communities wonderful. To me, the Democratic Party has taken on the mantle of big government and the public sector unions and the influence peddling, especially here in California. And I don't believe that Californians want huge government taxing and spending. I think there's a small minority that would probably like to live off the government, but I think most people in California want to be left alone, want to get the opportunity to have their own business or to work in a small business. I'm a small businessman. I'm not running as some creature of Wall Street or anything like that.
And John, what's your position on immigration and sanctuary cities? Because that is a flashpoint in California where some cities refuse to enforce federal policy and that sort of thing. What's your position on those?
Carrie, my family fled the czars in 19th century Russia and came to a country legally and wanted to participate in the American dream. I think we need more immigration, but it has to be immigration that is controlled, and it has to be immigration where people become Americans and kind of assimilate. Remember, our motto is E pluribus unum, out of many one. That means we all come to America for freedom, for liberty, for the opportunity that this country is held in the shining city on the hill that President Reagan talked about. That means that we need to have more legal immigration, but it also means that we need to stop the cascade of drugs and crime that really have poured in over our southern border. You know, we have a 3,000-mile unprotected border with Canada, and of course, the issue there is that Canada is relatively not corrupt and organized, and therefore we don't have to worry about gun runners and drug dealers.
Well, I think our resident Canadian on the panel
I'm
would
Canadian.
agree with you.
I can confirm that.
Yeah.
We're all nice.
Great.
Nice people.
Well, thank you so much, John Cox. It's been a pleasure to have you, and thanks for waking up so early with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
And now let's go to our regular Bookster segment. As our loyal viewers know, Bookster is a millennial community passionate about books, and they are an amazing partner of Bold. This week we have Mark Lilla with us. He is a professor at Columbia, and he's here to discuss his new book, The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics. The book argues that driven originally by a sincere desire to protect the most vulnerable Americans, the left has now unwittingly balkanized the electorate, encouraged self-absorption rather than solidarity, this is his words, and invested its energies in social movements rather than in party politics. Professor Lilla also argues that in the contest for the American imagination, liberals have abdicated. Welcome, Professor.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
With us. So tell us what your book is about. We gave a little intro, but in your own words.
In my own words, were I to say what the punchline is for liberals, it is that you can't help anyone if you don't have power. And we have lost power. It was very interesting thinking about the events in Charlottesville. And it occurred to me while looking at it, I would have thought that if we were going to have incidents like that, it would have happened while we had a black president. My God, right? Instead, it happened because we have Donald Trump, and Donald Trump emboldened them. So even though we have to combat the racism and the groups that were behind this, we need to think about how we got to Donald Trump being president. And I don't mean losing the last election. We're too hung up as liberals on presidential elections. Over the past 2 generations, liberals have lost the country. Republicans control 2/3 of our state legislatures. They control 2/3 of our governorships. They control 24 states outright. Someone recently pointed out to me that if they win 2 more states outright, that they can call a constitutional convention. Now, that, to my mind, is the biggest threat to the rights of all the groups that people in identity politics care about. Voting rights of African Americans, abortion rights for women, the right just to walk down the street holding hands for gays and lesbians. So the question is, why have we lost them? And I think, as I say in the quote that you repeated, that we've lost the contest for the imagination of the American public, a message that offers a vision of what we are as a country, what we all share as citizens, all of us, and the kind of country we want to build. Instead, we fell, during the Reagan years, into a rhetoric of difference and identity that not only, I think, excited an identitarianism among whites on the right, though we're not responsible for it existing, but more importantly, it's taken our eye off the ball. We think of politics now in terms of particular movements rather than coming together as a party and operating through institutional politics to take back the country from the right.
Right, and I'm going to read a quote that you have from Ted Kennedy at the beginning of your book, where you said there's a difference between being a party that cares about women and being the women's party. There's a difference between being the party that cares about minorities without becoming a minority party. And that was from Ted Kennedy, who was a white man. And, I as a conservative, I agreed with pretty much everything in your book, except that you're liberal. I agreed as someone who has sat and had to bite my tongue as I'm called a racist because I have a disagreement on the minimum wage or I have a disagreement on a budget deficit. I'm not a racist. And yet that is the language that I have to sit and I have to listen to. And as a woman, I have to be called, I'm self-loathing and I hate women when I don't. And this sort of identity politics sadly has consumed our popular culture, our universities, our media, our Hollywood. It's all there. And when I saw what happened in Charlottesville, to me, it was the yin to the yang. That's how I read it, was this dark, evil use of identity politics is now being spilled over to the right. And I found that to be so tragic. That was my read of Charlottesville in light of how I was reading your book at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I will say one thing, and that is that people who are involved with identity politics assert something which is true, and that is that you cannot understand the problems in this country without taking into account identity. You can't understand poverty, you can't understand all sorts of other things. But doing something about that means not talking about our differences, but finding a message based on principles that will attract people who are not us. And the approach of the identitarian left has been this, when they go canvassing, so to speak. They go and they knock on a door and they say, I'm canvassing for the Democratic Party, but before I give you my message, I'd like to give you 3 tickets. Your first ticket is for your privilege. Your second ticket is for your whiteness. The third is for your homophobia. I hope to see you on Tuesday. Now, that is just guaranteed to put people off. What we have to get to is the core of the principles we stand for that everyone can recognize. And it seems to me that liberals have always stood for two principles. One is equal protection under the law, and I think most conservatives, I think, recognize that. We just argue about which cases. Second principle is solidarity, and that is that citizens are not roadkill. They are not the tail of the distribution. If someone falls behind, we stick together, and we can legitimately use government to enfranchise people into this society. Now that, most of the things that people in identity politics care about fall under the principle of equal protection under the law. Most of the things that economic progressives care about fall under the rubric of solidarity. So if were we to speak in terms of these principles, I think to speak of solidarity to a coal miner and to speak of solidarity to a single woman in an urban area who can't get daycare in order to go to a job, that's something that binds them. And that's the change in strategy that we need.
And speaking of solidarity, the most gripping image, I think, from this weekend in Charlottesville was the image of the car ramming into a crowd. And in the car is believed to be pretty much a neo-Nazi or white supremacist. And you could see signs and obviously bodies being thrown into the air. And it's the most visible sign actually said solidarity. And I think there was another one that said love, right? And so, my response as a liberal is, when I look at that image, when I think about what happened this weekend, is it the Democrats that are playing identity politics, or is it the Republicans? When the leader of the Republican Party, the President of the United States, is sympathizing with neo-Nazis.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that this white identitarianism was caused by concern about minorities. I mean, this goes way back in American history. But if you play the identity card, you had better be prepared to be trumped, so to speak, by another card. It's not a game we can win. It may work for them in some situations. It doesn't work for us. And there's something that binds us.
What do you mean by that? It works for them?
Well, I think Trump was able successfully to rally some people, not just through dog whistles, but through a kind of encouragement of a kind of racism. The way he spoke about Arab American soldiers, for God's sake, or spoke about a Latino judge. Right. This was not a dog whistle. This was very, very, very clear. And there's something that distinguishes us, and I think even Republicans, from what went on there. That picture you spoke about it, the car going at the crowd. I've been kind of looking at the right-wing sites after this, the far right. And they also had that picture. And underneath it said, "How do you like my car?" That's what we're fighting.
Right. Well, and it is true that, white people played white identity politics. It was happening in the Democratic Party. Robert Byrd was a longtime senator and member of the KKK. When that segregation speech of segregation now, segregation forever by George Wallace, he was a Democrat when he gave that speech. So that's nothing new to have it on both sides as far as the parties. But when it came to the Civil Rights Act, Barry Goldwater in 1964 came out against it, and that was where you saw black support, which had been for the Republican Party. It had been the party of Lincoln, and during the New Deal, black support tapered. But for Dwight Eisenhower helped usher in a precursor to the Civil Rights Act, and he got 39% of the black vote in 1956. I mean, certainly there was a lot of fraternity, sorority, whatever you want to say, for black voters and Republicans, and that all went away in 1964. I know in your book you trace it more to Reaganism. I would trace it even maybe further to the 60s, where we saw the Republican Party turn their back and say, I think for a lot of Republicans, it isn't that they're overtly racist. It's just that they don't have any exposure to a lot of black voters. I'm from Utah, which is a very, very white area, and we don't see racism, a lot of people would say, because we don't have any people of other races. And the few that are, we treat them very well because it's a Mormon state and we believe in universal love and not race-specific love. So for a lot of conservatives, I think they, when that happened in 1964, they just kind of circled the wagons and said, we don't need black voters. And Democrats said, well, we'll be more than happy to play the identity card. And it's created this train wreck now.
Yeah, well, Republicans are at a disadvantage because they don't have a language of solidarity. That's a Republican version of solidarity. Instead, you're on your own. It's the message that comes through. But I saw exactly what you're talking about in my own life. I grew up in Macomb County, Michigan. I don't know if that means anything to either of you, but it's famous in Democratic circles as the home of the Reagan Democrats. Macomb County is just over the border of Detroit, entirely blue collar. Eminem's famous 8 Mile Road. I grew up on 12 Mile Road, just above the border. And up until 1968, that county was the most liberal county, suburban county in America. Entirely blue collar. 1972, George Wallace won the Democratic primary, and he won a greater proportion of the vote in the general election than in any county north of the Mason-Dixon line. And from thereafter, they voted for Nixon and the Republicans. Now, were these people racist before the 60s and the fights over busing and the riots? Yeah, I think they were. And I grew up in a very racist environment. But what happened was that the race issues, the identity issues, got them distracted from the economic issues and also the principles that they held on to until all of this was stirred up. And we don't have to turn our backs on our views about race and inequality in this country. But we need to develop a language that both minorities and, well, now they're going to be a minority, white Americans, can both recognize together as speaking to them.
Great. Well, Professor, it's been a pleasure to have you here. Yeah, I feel like this conversation is just getting started. So make sure you check out the book. It's been a pleasure to have the professor here, the Once and Future Liberal. Thank you so much, Professor Mark Lilla.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us here on Bold TV. Thank you, Liz,
Thank
for
you.
coming along with the ride.
This is so much fun.
Yeah. And sure, as usual, make sure that you come back on Friday, 9 a.m. 10 a.m. Fridays, and Tuesday, 9 a.m. for Bold Business with David Grasso. As always, thank you so much for joining. If you like the show, make sure to share it with your friends and keep the conversation going.
Thanks, guys.